So let's get started. We have a big program today. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. I'm Margot Mathis, and I work for the WHO as part of the core team who is working on this infectious hazard Foresight project. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the third EPI-WIN webinar of this series to continue the discussion on the global trends that are shaping our world. As usual, the recording of the webinar and the slides will be made available, and my colleague Kat will put the link into the chat. I'm very pleased to be joined today by a fantastic set of panelists to discuss the global trends that are shaping our world. So first, Alexander Alexiou, so who you would know if you have followed the first webinars. Alex is a senior Foresight strategic at Arups. He works with organizations across virtually every industry to identify and analyze trends, explore future possibilities, and plan scenarios that build resilience for the future. Alex works closely with the WHO, leading the scenario planning exercise about the future of COVID-19 and better pandemic preparedness. Welcome back, Alex. We have also with us today Matthew Lim, who is the head of the Biosecurity and Health Security Protection Unit at WHO. This unit focuses on developing WHO guidance and assisting member states in three principal areas of work: laboratory, biosecurity and biosafety, the interface of the health and security sectors, including in mitigating accidental or deliberate threats to public health, and emerging technological and scientific health security risks, including misinformation, disinformation, and hybrid warfare. Welcome, Matthew. We have with us also Dr. Miguel Wengo Oros, who is the Chief Data Scientist at UN Global Pulse. So UN Global Pulse is the UN Secretary General Initiative on Digital Innovation and Artificial Intelligence. He is a scientist, engineer, and entrepreneur. He has pioneered the use of big data and AI for global health, sustainable development, and humanitarian action. Welcome, Miguel. We have also with us Elena Villalobos-Prats, who is the WHO Country Support and Capacity Building Lead at the Climate Change and Health Unit in WHO. She's responsible for technical and programming guidance on climate change and health. Welcome, Elena, and thank you for joining us. We know it's a busy time for you with the COP26. We also have with us Professor Ingrid Volkmer. She is a professor of digital communication and globalization at the University of Melbourne, and she has published widely in these areas. She has recently led the global study on social media and COVID-19, a global study of digital crisis interaction among Generation Z and millennials, in cooperation with Wonderman Thompson, Paul Fish, and the WHO. She is actively involved in digital policy debates. In 2019, she has been appointed by the OECD to the expert group on AI governance. And in 2021, she has also been invited to contribute to ITU's implementation of eco-friendly technologies. And she's a co-author of the policy guidelines. Welcome, Ingrid. And last but not least, we have been joined at the last minute by Professor Ilona Kickbush. She's the founder of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. Her areas of expertise include the political determinant of health, health in all policies, and global health. Welcome, Ilona. So I think with this excellent panel, I'm sure we'll have very fruitful discussion on the trends we selected today. If you have any question you'd like to ask to the panelists, please put them in the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So I think we can start with Alex for a description of some selected trends. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Margot, and what a wonderful panel indeed. I'm going to share my screen. And can I please confirm that you can see it? You can. Brilliant. Thanks, Margot. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are watching us today from. My name is Alex. As Margot mentioned, I'm a senior consultant with Arups Foresight team in London, and For the past few months, actually since June this year, if I'm not mistaken, I have been working very closely with Margot and her team in the WHO on a scenario planning exercise to build 4 scenarios for the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years. For those of you who don't know Arup, we are an independent firm of designers, planners, engineers, consultants, and technical specialists. And we offer a broad range of professional services across all scales and all sectors of the built environment. Arup Foresight is Arup's think tank and strategic foresight consultancy. And our mission is to understand change, identify opportunities, and enable a more sustainable future. Today, as Margot mentioned, we will talk about trends. And for those of you who are joining us again and who joined the session on Tuesday, some of this will sound and will look very familiar. So please do bear with us until we get to the part that's new for today. So today we're going to briefly talk about what a trend is, the importance of trends in the scenario planning process. And in the second part of my talk, I will present you the trends that we have identified as the ones shaping the future of the COVID-19 pandemic in the next 3 to 5 years. And we have selected 5 trends for you today to discuss with our wonderful panelists. So what is a trend? In its simplest sense, a trend is a direction or vector along which particular forces or agents of change travel. Trends can be social products, they can be social movements, they can be processes, or even people. They can be increasing, decreasing, or they can remain stable, and they are likely to have a long-term impact on systems and large social groups. However, what used to be a trend in the past doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a trend in the future. And just to make this definition a little bit more relatable, what I like doing is I like to think of trends as this complex and interconnected system or network of highways, right? Where each highway is a trend, right? Each direction of travel is a trend. And the vehicles that travel on this highway are the driving forces, are these agents of change that I just mentioned. And in the same way that we have vehicles that travel on highways that are fast or slow, that are small or big or long or noisy or quiet. In the same way, we have trends that manifest and express themselves in different ways. These highways have lanes, right? And sometimes these lanes, they split and they create smaller lanes, narrower lanes. Which end up probably to some sort of country road or local road or regional road, and then they probably rejoin the highway at some point. In the same way that in this trend ecosystem, we have what we call weak signals. And similarly, we have lanes that merge and gradually they become larger and larger in a highway. In the same way that we have trends that gradually graduate to another level and they become megatrends. And just to give you a little bit more information on the difference between a trend, a megatrend, and a weak signal, a megatrend is this long underlying evolutionary change, right? That it's very slow to form, but when it does, it has a major impact on a wide range of activities and a wide range of people and a wide range of systems. And on the other end of this spectrum, on the other end of this trilogy, we have a weak signal. And a weak signal is this snippet of information, this snippet of change that it's too novel to really understand the impact that it might have on a future system. Why are trends important in the scenario planning process? Well, the simple answer is because they are the actual building blocks of a scenario planning process, right? They are those core elements of each scenario. They represent the ecosystem of change within which we explore the future. And in this case, for this exercise with the WHO, the ecosystem of change is the COVID-19 pandemic. So the better the trends, the better the scenarios you're going to build. What is important in this case, and when we talk about trends and the relationship with scenarios, is the time horizon, is the time frame, right? I mean, when one looks into the future, the trends that you're going to identify and the trends that you're going to use to build a scenario, if you look into, let's say, 3 to 5 years into the future, are going to be massively different compared to the trends that you would use, you would identify, and you would analyze if your scenario planning exercise was looking into, let's say, 10 or 20 years into the future. For this exercise, for our scenario planning project with the WHO, our time horizon is 3 to 5 years. And the reason we chose this time horizon is because we want our scenarios to be translated easily into action, into strategy on how to better manage the current pandemic and on how to be better prepared, for any future infectious threat. Now, which are the trends that are shaping the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats in the next 3 to 5 years? With Margot and her team in the WHO, we embarked on this journey starting with horizon scanning exercise, right? And this horizon scanning exercise gave us a number of trends that we feel are the ones that will shape the next 3 to 5 years of COVID-19. And in these cases, what we do is that we use what we call the STIP framework to analyze and categorize these trends. And the STIP framework is essentially a framework that ensures that the trends we are using and the trends we are choosing and the trends we are identifying really reflect a wide coverage of issues from social to political. So these are the 25 trends we identified for the future of the COVID-19 pandemic in the next 3 to 5 years. And as you can see on the social category, we have things like intersectional inequalities and vulnerabilities, growing and aging population, urbanization and densification, new ways of working and information communication patterns. And on the technological category, we have things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, healthcare innovation and innovation in bio and nanotechnology, logistics and supply chain digitization, data and IP and digital interfaces. On the economic category, we have economic migration, trade in local economies, the role of the private sector in humanitarian and health crisis, which we're going to talk about later today, mobility and travel and shifts in economic power. In the environmental category, biodiversity loss, resource depletion and sustainable energy, climate resilience and net zero, food and water security and circular economy. And lastly, but not least, political category, deglobalization, governance models, breakdown in trust of institutions, rise in power of independent actors, and data privacy and cybersecurity risks. So as I said, we picked 5 trends for you and for our panelists today to talk about. These are information communication patterns, role of the private sector in humanitarian and health crisis, climate resilience and net zero, governance models, and data privacy and cybersecurity risks. Hopefully we'll have enough time to go through all of them, but just to give you a little bit more information for each one of them. Regarding information and communication patterns, I'm pretty sure you would all agree with me if I said that the way we communicate with each other and the way we produce, we consume, we reproduce, and we exchange information has dramatically changed since the invention of the smartphone in 2006, right? So like every tech invention, the smartphones and everything that comes with them, they can be used with bad and good intentions, right? And on the one hand, for example, you have smartphones really revolutionizing the way that people communicate with each other and the way that people conduct business in sub-Saharan Africa, really contributing to local economies and local societies and local communities. And on the other hand, you have like this massive addiction to our smartphones that leads to a number of mental health issues, especially in younger populations. Now, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, because it is important to really think about each one of these trends in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. At a moment where physical connection wasn't really possible over the past, let's say, 18 months, smartphones and other online platforms and technological tools really brought us together, both from a professional and a personal point of view, right? But at the same time, they were these platforms where misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and generally false information around the COVID-19 pandemic really started and really flourished. So 2 sides on this trend, right? And it would be really interesting to hear what our panelists think about how this will evolve and how we can make better use of social media and online platforms in terms of better, more effective communication and information in the future. Second trend for today, the role of the private sector in humanitarian and health crisis. And this is not really something new, right? I mean, we have seen an increased role of the private sector in these settings and in these contexts and during global health crisis over the past couple of decades. One good example, of course, is the 2014 Ebola crisis in Western Africa, where private sector contributed more than $300 million in the public health response. And we have seen the same happening with COVID-19, right? We have seen private organizations, private institutions really repurposing their production models, their business models, their production lines, and even their production facilities to start producing things like, hand sanitizers, PPE, masks, etc., to really contribute to the ongoing public health response, especially at a time where public institutions and public bodies really struggled with managing the COVID-19 pandemic. A question that arises here is how much of a private intervention, how much of a private contribution is too much, perhaps, right? Is there a limit? Is there a balance between this duality between public and private sector contribution and intervention in times of a global health crisis? Third trend for today, one from the environmental category, climate resilience and net zero. And of course, these two fall under this big mega trend of climate change, of course, right? Alongside other things like biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, water security, etc. And what really, the question that really, or the main thing that is really key from this trend, and it's worth keeping in mind, is that climate change and the impacts of climate change are directly linked to human health and planetary health, right? So going forward and navigating the current pandemic, but also anticipating future pandemics, it is really key, and it will be really key to align our climate mitigation efforts, because these will also be efforts that will reflect on the human and the planetary health, right? A healthy planet means healthy humans, means less pandemic outbreaks. Next trend for today, governance models. And again, a lot of discussion around governance models and how different nations and different countries really responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and how they organized their public health response. We had many examples over the past 18 months. We had countries and nations that really, adopted more, let's say, populistic or nationalistic or even authoritarian approaches in managing the pandemic and organizing their public health response. And at the same time, we had countries and nations that chose a more democratic, let's say, path where citizen participation and putting their people and their citizens at the forefront and making them part of the decision-making process was very, very central. It is interesting to reflect on these two or more than two approaches and see which of them were effective, why and why not, right? And see what we can do to perhaps improve on that front in the future. And then last but not least, we have data privacy and cybersecurity risks. And there is again a lot of discussion around data, like ethical and correct use of data monitoring, data storing, etc. It is without doubt data collection has always been central in in really understanding how populations and how large groups of people really behave and how move and how they navigate space. And this has been very, very important during the COVID-19 pandemic, because data collection has been, the cornerstone of monitoring the pandemic, monitoring the evolution of the virus and stopping it potentially. Contact tracking and contact tracing being a very good example. But at the same time, we had a lot of concerns about data privacy and a lot of instances where we had data breaches and we had like wrong use or storing or management or sharing of data and information, something that in turn resulted in reduced trust between citizens and their governments or the bodies that really handle and manage this data. So all these risks and all this whole discourse around regulatory frameworks or better management of data in the future and how we can really mitigate the cybersecurity risks that come to the front as we become more digital and more connected, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic. These questions will be very, very, very central. And with that, I will stop here. I will put a comma. I will pass it back to Margot If you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A section. I will happily answer them for you. And thank you very much. Margot, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Great presentation, great outlines of these trends and some of the key issues related to them. I think actually in the Q&A you have a question you can respond to maybe in a written form. And in the meantime, I'd like to hand over to Ingrid to start expressing a little bit your thought about these global trends. And maybe I have a more precise question about how to control infodemic and the waves of fake news, disinformation. What is the role of the younger generation for that? Should we have a global regulatory framework for social media? Is this feasible? So over to you. Thank you, Ingrid. Ingrid, you're on mute.
All right, here we go. And thanks for having me. I'm really keen to discuss not just our study, but what these outcomes might mean for exactly these areas on digital policy on a global scale. And I would even argue we need a new dimension and a new approach to digital policy in context of crisis on a global scale, perhaps, and move away from these traditional approaches to deal with Facebook and the big four platforms. But there is much more to be said about that. And I just want to highlight some of these issues. So, sorry, I need to stop share my screen. Is always a bit funny. Here we go. I feel I can share, but I can't enlarge my screen. Unfortunately, my computer does not like that a lot. So I hope you can see this. I can enlarge this a bit. So what I wanted to talk about is communication, social media, and beyond, because our study had a focus on social media and COVID-19, which it was a global study of digital crisis interaction among Generation Z and millennials. The study was conducted by the global survey company Wunderman Thompson and Paulfish as well. And we conducted the study in collaboration with the WHO in 24 countries with about 23,000 respondents. So it's a massive study at the time of crisis in these countries. So we picked countries where which were identified on the WHO dashboard as heightened crisis regions at a certain point in time, which was in across November to January this year, or last year, and then January this year, and that's where we conducted the survey. This is the report about key results, which will be published in the next few weeks. So it says like 80 pages or so, with some key insights. But what I want to talk about today, because I only have 5 minutes and I will be very much aware of my time, is just to look at new dimensions of crisis communication and look at social media, but also beyond. So what are the outcomes of these results and how can we take them into the future? And I think that is the discussion you want to have here. So I have identified, let's say, 5 dimensions, which I would highlight here, and then perhaps we can discuss some other time or today. First of all, it's really a move away from this sort of centrality on national media, on national governments, on national crisis management that we are seeing coming through this study. And I think that was also something Alexander has just mentioned as a global trend, and if I read their charts correctly. So what it meant here in our context is that we argue that these, especially generations and millennials, engage with a globally interdependent crisis horizon. And that is really important. So they don't just use social media, they don't just use platforms, but they interact on platforms with peers in other countries. They interact on platforms with scientists, with the WHO. So that is this interdependence and the crisis interdependence that we are seeing coming through. And in a way, I wouldn't say replacing this centrality on national crisis communication that we have seen for decades, but it's starting to make it more porous. So there is a bit of a porosity of this national emphasis on crisis communication through media. So that is something I want to highlight first. So they look at the diversity of digital platforms, and also through this engagement with multiple individually chosen platforms, big and small, they develop their own individual crisis narrative. And that is also very important. It's an in a way, an individualization of crisis interaction as well. So they go and access the WHO, scientists, all sorts of international sources that are available on digital platforms, and move away from their national framework. And this applies to almost all countries, actually. That's a dimension we've seen here in our study too. Dimension two, we would also argue, and we heard that earlier, Margot, you raised that, fake news and this digital policy. The respondents we included here were, we would argue, crisis communication literate. They are aware of fake news. They know how to leave their filter bubbles in time of a crisis. That's a very interesting aspect of our study. They manage large group of followers, and I would even argue they are really curators of their own large group of followers, their own communities, which in some cases included more than 5,000 followers, actually. So that's another point, and that applies not just to Western world, and I just need to make it a little bit smaller again, but also to middle and low income countries where all sorts of platforms are used, perhaps mainly the big ones, owned by Google and Facebook. But in other countries, there's a massive list of different social media platforms that we are seeing. And when we look at digital policy, again, coming back to Margot, to your point, digital policy, basically, they also always talk about Facebook, talk about the big platforms, but we need to also look at smaller platforms. And that is really something crucial I want to highlight here. What we also see at fourth dimension, and then I come to the fifth, and that's my last one. What we see in our study is what I call pyramid model of information seeking behavior. And I will give you some examples for that, because these, although you might not read the small print, but you can see where these blue columns are, or these blue lines are. So we asked them which sources they specifically trust, or highly trust, and somewhat trust. In this heightened crisis, and this is from Brazil, and it looks very similar in other countries too, they somewhat trust alternative movement leaders. In this case, they somewhat trust only my social media community, information and messaging apps, and so on. And in this case, they also only somewhat trust family and my government. If you then move to the next category, which is, or the last one, let's say highly trust, and again, across all countries, everything else goes, and they highly trust scientists and the World Health Organization. In the middle section with trust, you sometimes see national variations, but what we really see is they only somewhat trust across all the countries, these sort of social media communities, etc., but they highly trust science experts and the WHO. So that's another outcome. And finally, my last dimension are the splinter platforms, these small platforms that are rising. In a way, it's the TikTokization of social media. We are seeing there will be more and more highly specialized, highly targeting certain communities, platforms across the world. We have Discord, which is, some people say, the Skype for gamers. It's a gaming community across the world, but these are highly trusted, small groups of users of these platforms, but they also communicate crisis communication, and they are often ignored when we think about social media and crisis communication. So my argument is, look at splinter platforms rising. There is more about digital policy, fake news around splinter platforms, because they are not really included in our big debates we're having across the world. So these are just some snapshots for you, and I will stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. It was a very good presentation. You raised a lot of good points. One of them is really trust, and we see this as a big issue. And to talk about it, maybe I hand over to Ilona Kickbush, who can provide thoughts about trust in governments, in public authorities, or in science. How is communicated the information, how to build trust to ensure that communities follow the public health recommendation. Thank you, Ilona.
Thank you very much, Margot. I don't have any slides. I just want to share some thoughts with you. I've just come back from the World Health Summit in Berlin, where many of the issues that you are raising now were also discussed in different fora. And it was very interesting in the last of the panels, the closing panel that we had. The closing words were by the Finnish Prime Minister. Sana Marin, and she highlighted when she was talking about the COVID-19 response of her country and the success that they had, that in her view, and also the view of researchers, the key reason was public trust. And trust along two lines, not only trust in the government, but also that people trusted one another to act responsibly. And I think we must keep these different dimensions of trust in mind. Now, of course, you don't establish trust overnight. And that, of course, is one of the key concerns of many political scientists who have been looking at what has happened around COVID-19. Because actually in societies where those two dimensions of trust are not given, either societies are ideologically divided for a whole number of reasons. Often they are also very divided in terms of equity, of income, of living conditions, etc. And often the political climate is very confrontational. That then, of course, when a common challenge comes in, such as a pandemic, then the groundwork or the stable ground is not there on which you can actually build. But then, of course, a pandemic is politically exploited. And this is what we have seen in many countries, not only in high-income countries. Everyone, of course, first thinks of the Trump administration. But here in Switzerland, that is the case. In Germany, it's been the case. And in many low and middle-income countries, it's been the case as well. And has brought with it some rather disconcerting developments. And of course, once that trust is not there and your society is divisive, the pandemic divides you even more. And the challenges of building it up together. And I think Alexander mentioned democracy also. We are seeing there are a whole number of democracy indices around the world, that actually there is a pullback, a drawback of democracy. And that in some societies, this lack of trust and controversy has been used to actually strengthen the power of certain populist and authoritarian movements. We've been talking with the colleagues, for example, from Denmark. I mentioned Finland, where they've done quite a bit of research. And I spoke on the one hand to researchers like Michael Bang-Peterson, who's been working on collecting data, and on the other hand, with the chief medical officer, Søren Bøstrøm. And there they put another element in, which of course, in a way is also built on trust, that with trust comes radical transparency. And I use this word radical transparency just like Søren Bøstrøm from the government used it. He said we had to inform our population every step of the way why we were doing certain things. We need to provide arguments, not only evidence, because people don't understand all evidence you put forward, particularly medical and epidemiological evidence and all these new terms that were introduced. But really to go into a tremendous effort to explain what you're doing and actually strengthen the trust during a pandemic, because you need people to work together on the common good. And you need to make sure you're not only saving yourself, you're saving your neighbor. Even if you don't care about yourself, care about your neighbor, and the other way around. So I think it's absolutely intriguing in terms of governance that through COVID-19, the trust component of political science research, the trust we need in public health for public health measures, and the trust we need for pandemic response is absolutely critical. If I can just, before I end, put in an advertisement slot, and that is at the World Health Summit, We launched, you probably can't see it, the new Lancet report, the Lancet and Financial Times Commission on Governing Health Futures, Growing Up in a Digital World, which puts forward proposals around governing the digital transformation, quite consciously not governing digital technologies, but governing the digital transformation. I guess it's a long-term trend or a mega trend or whatever. And here too, the issue of a trust architecture, which relates to privacy, to common good, etc., is very much in the forefront. So we see these political discussions are becoming important as a key component, I believe, for many of the big radical changes and risks and crises that we will be seeing in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilona. Very good, good insights, and you know, the need for radical transparency. This is a new terminology for me, but very interesting. So you mentioned that pandemic and crisis in general are politically exploited and not necessarily for the common good, unfortunately. But I'd like to switch a little bit the discussion to a more positive note, maybe. So I'd like to ask Matt, if you have observed during this pandemic, maybe any good governance model or mechanism that maybe countries should tend to in the future to be better prepared or to enhance solidarity between countries. Matt, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me to this panel. So in terms of good governance models, I mean, I think there's just as there have been some evidence, some instances that we can probably all think of governments that failed to rise to the challenge, there are those that have really succeeded very well. In terms of what I think has succeeded, it's where political leaders have really had that trust that Ilona speaks about, trusting in public health, trusting the scientists, giving them the space and the platforms to communicate effectively about the sciences, both what is known and what is not known. I think it takes an unusual degree of courage and self-confidence to be able to step aside and give the platform to the scientists and say, well, here is what we know, here is what we think, but we could be wrong. Here is what we don't know, but these are the plans that we need to advance based on our best understanding, and we will adapt and modify as things go along. Some of the other governance models that have really succeeded, Alex has sort of mentioned already that in some countries, a sort of a more federated approach has seemed to had some success, where you have top level overall guidance and mobilization and working with parliamentarians and other civic leaders, but really allowing public health leaders closer to the ground to implement and to adapt as things go. I'm not sure that there's one governance model that can be sort of advertised as being best for all countries and all circumstances, but in general, the ones where the political leadership has really taken up the challenge of leading, bringing together political leaders, legislative leaders, the private sector, the civil society, and forging that sense of popular will and commitment, and then trusting the scientists to identify what they think is best. And make proposals on what they think is best. And when it turns out that the science is changing or the data is evolving, to be willing to step back and say, look, what we said was true 6 months ago is not necessarily true now. And that's life. And that's what we call science. And we need to be able to adapt and modify our plans on the fly. I think governments that have succeeded in mastering that technique and haven't fallen back on platitudes or just sort of empty slogans or being too wedded to pre-existing plans. Though the governments that are nimble and adaptive have been the ones that have been the most successful in governance, and they're also the ones who I think are proving to be the most effective at multilateral cooperation, because they recognize that it's not purely about what happens at the national level. It's also about the international cooperation, because it's a cliche, it's a truism. You know, viruses know no borders. But it is absolutely true. Even though all politics is local and all government is, you know, kind of flows up from the population it's supposed to serve, when it comes to these emerging global threats, like pandemic threats or other things as well, some of the mega trends that Alex has described already, it is also absolutely true that no country is an island, and that there isn't any permanent success on a national level. All of these problems have to be addressed together across a wide base of communities, actors, countries, and all the relevant players. So yeah, I know we're a little bit short on time, so I'll stop there, but I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, really important and good points about what points should be included in a good governance model. You mentioned, yeah, adaptability, solidarity, but also inclusiveness. You also mentioned the principle of good risk communication. So I think to help us to tend to these good models, we can use the power of big data and AI. They provide great opportunities to help us to anticipate, but also to better respond to epidemics, or to better communicate, of course. So here I'd like to hand over to Miguel. Maybe Miguel, can you talk to us a little bit about also the risks? How do we ensure that data does not fall in the wrong hands, or are stored, used, and managed in the wrong way? Thank you. Over to you, Miguel.
Merci, Margot. Okay, I guess that this is not new. So we are in the middle of this digital revolution, and every industry, from manufacturing, finance, leisure, mobility, is being disrupted. And essentially, it's about the data, but it's also about the insights that you get from the data. Okay, and here's where it comes like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all these techniques, which are essentially, optimizing and changing many business. So, I guess that just linking with what Alex says, something important right now and relevant to us also is that we are starting to see the emergence of regulation around artificial intelligence. We are seeing how regulation around privacy is somehow appearing in different, in every part of the world, with different geostrategic interests behind. It's not the same how the East or China is approaching than how Europe is approaching and how the US is approaching. But all that, I guess that related to pandemic, something is clear that we have a very good opportunity in terms of public health intelligence. Okay, I think we can leverage something that we have not leveraged before. We can combine data sources. We have multimodalities, not just like questionnaires that we used to do. We can use social media signals, we can use radio signals, we can use mobility purchases, name it. We can go for non-traditional places. We can start to work in real time. And for me, what we need to create is the concept of digital public good. So for me, this public health intelligence has to be like the weather map. So we can all see the weather in our places. We also start to see weather forecast. So I think we have to work on seeing the weather and start to work on the forecast as a digital public good. So then what? Then we can have like real-time outbreak detection. Then we can work on mathematical models for epidemic spreading, and not just in the US or Europe. For instance, for refugees or internal displaced populations. That's crazy, but there are more than 80 million people which are not living in their homes, which is more than 1% of the population, and they got less than 1 per 1,000 of the teams of the world working in modeling. There is another point of care diagnostics, which would feed into these systems. We can think also on digital contact tracing, and this is particularly interesting because this also is not about the air regulation, but it's about the privacy regulations we were talking before. So, and actually there are two concepts here. One is, the privacy for the individuals, but the other is, we have not talked a lot, is about group privacy. Because sometimes what we need to protect with these regulations are particular vulnerable populations, it can be children, or particular ethnics in particular countries, and so on. So I think we are seeing this shift. I hope that really we get the last push. So we own our own data. We share it with in the right way, that in case there is a problem, it will not be misused. So, I mean, I think that another point here is that this job has to be multidisciplinary. We need people from different perspectives, and something that perhaps now we are realizing more, but it has taken a time. It's not just the health domain, it's not just technology, it's also sociology and many others. So, I mean, I guess that these are part of the opportunities. Maybe another dimension of this is the fact, I mean, this connects with my colleagues. I mean, so now, I mean, we said smartphones, I mean, almost everywhere we can connect ourselves in different ways. I think connected to this infodemic problem, it's important to mention that there are there's another tension which is shaping the world, which is maybe this hate speech against freedom of expression. And I see that somehow the discussion around the pandemic have been trapped into this discussion plus political concerns. And maybe it's important that to build the trust that we need and trust in science, we need to manage to decouple science from politics. I think that is going to be part of, I mean, one of the reasons, if we succeed to do that, it will be much easier to manage future pandemics. And maybe just one last comment. I think also this might not be just for 5 years from now, maybe it's a little bit more, but we are seeing how, I mean, now it's not just social media platforms. We're talking about the metaverse. We're saying that my daughter will spend maybe 6 hours in the somewhere in the digital world. Maybe it's not going to be just a smartphone. It's going to be connected with the fingertips, connected with the glasses, maybe with a helmet that in neurotechnologies that can read and even write with some of what we are thinking, or we think that we are thinking. So, I mean, I guess that also is going to be important on how, I mean, how we work in the future. It has two dimensions. One that directly go to communications, but the other goes with another maybe slow motion pandemic, which is around mental health. So what is going to be the impact? What is already the impact of the use of all these technologies and will be in the future, not just for our behaviors, but also, I mean, outside, but even, I mean, inside. So this is another point I think is worth raising. It's about like mental health pandemics and the impact that technology and this maybe multiverse will take it, and how we are going to make sure that we develop these technologies in a responsible way. I think we have to go ahead and start thinking on risk and harms and how to mitigate them, I mean, before it's too late. But yeah, so happy to discuss more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Miguel. Really good points. I like your optimism because I talked about risk and you talked about opportunities. So that's really good. And another opportunity maybe for this pandemic is to make a change about the consideration of people and governments about climate. So I'd like to give the floor to Elena about climate change and the infectious disease, maybe the link between the two, and what can we do to build healthier communities through climate change mitigation. Over to you, thank you.
Thanks so much, Margot, and thanks for giving the Climate Change and Health team in WHO the opportunity to present. As you rightly mentioned, there are, I think there is no doubt now that climate change is real. That is basically the responsibility of human intervention, and that there are clear interlinkages between climate variability and climate change and health. So relevant to today's discussions, most of the infectious disease transmission is going to be impacted and is already being impacted by changes in climate. So I'm aware of time, I will not go into details on this. Let me see if this works. Yeah, here is just to exemplify this. This is just a slide that I really like because it exemplifies how sensitive some infectious diseases, in this case a real disease, is to changes in weather variables. So in this case, the researchers look at temperature and precipitation, and they realize that for every 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature, there was an increase in 8% of the real diseases. So if you think about a country where the system is ready to react to this increase in attendance and people seeking for treatment, for basically access health system, then maybe there is not a problem. But thinking and reflecting on what happened with COVID and how all countries basically face challenges, just think what this can cause in countries, for example, in Africa. Similarly to Miguel, I think we are a little bit positive in the climate change domain. We were happy to see the Paris Agreement because we consider that if really implemented, this will be the most important public health treaty. Not only because it will help us to reduce, for example, the over 7 million deaths caused by air pollution, because as you know, some of the pollutants contributing to air pollution are also responsible for climate change, both short and long term. So basically, there is a real opportunity to mitigate and to maximize the health co-benefits of mitigation in other sectors. This year is a very important year for us globally and for the health community specifically because it's the first time that under the climate change negotiations in November, starting on the 30th, so in a couple of days, there will be an official health program. So basically the UK, as presidents of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they've prepared a full health program, which includes 4 key initiatives. And one is related to climate resilient health systems, another one to low carbon sustainable health systems, basically inviting the health sector to lead by example, reducing their emissions. The third one is promoting healthy, nationally determined contributions. So basically countries are expected to come to the COP with renewed commitments with regards to mitigation. So these are called NDCs. And we are trying to promote that those assess and maximize those mitigation options that will be translated into more health gains, for example, in the energy and the transport, in the urban planning sectors. And then there is another initiative related to mobilizing health voices for climate action. A few days ago, we already launched in collaboration with the whole health community a call for governments to act on climate change, signed by over 45 million health workers. This was already also signed by our Director General and my boss, basically, David Campbell-Lendron, cycled more than 850 kilometers from Geneva to London to bring this to health workers from the UK NHS, who are going to cycle also to Glasgow to bring this to the negotiators. Something that is relevant, and that is something that we've been promoting for over 15 years now, is basically a systematic approach to ensure that health systems become resilient to climate change. And something that was also mentioned by Miguel before is basically we are trying to promote the integration of climate and weather data within surveillance systems, not only to detect outbreaks as they happen, but really to forecast when, to predict when potential, the risk of potential outbreaks are going to happen. And we are piloting this in several countries across the world, including in Africa, Asia. And again, this is not always possible because the data requirements sometimes are a little bit sophisticated and not all countries have the data that is required with the resolution that is required. But it's, at least they can use, for example, seasonal trends to do risk mapping and some more basic interventions. And just to say, my last slide is basically reflecting on a poll that was conducted in the UK, where people was asked which were their professionals, the most trusted ones, no? And you see that politicians are not very well perceived by the general population, neither the people working in ministries, but the nurses and doctors, basically the public health community, are very well perceived. So this is really an opportunity for us to reflect on not only the possibility that we have to do individual choices, for example, reducing the intake of meat and promoting and having a more plant-based diet. So individually, just changing our consumption patterns, reducing our travel maybe, but also as a community, as institutionally, we really have to think about how we can decrease the environmental impact and the emissions that we are causing, and how we can communicate the interlinkages between climate change and health and the opportunities that we have to the overall community, because basically they trust us. So that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elena, really good points. And I like your presentation because we tackle very different trends during this session. But in the end, we see that they are all interrelated. You talked also during the presentation a lot about governance, about data, about trust. So everything is connected, and the same issue are raising for all the trends we are tackling. So we are almost done with our time today. And I see that Miguel and Alex have been very efficient in responding to your question in the Q&A. So I would like just maybe to turn over to each of the panelists today to provide final words, maybe some key messages to our audience today, so they keep in mind some key message. So over to you, Ingrid. Ingrid, I cannot hear you, sorry. You're on mute.
Yeah, Miguel mentioned the metaverse and that we need to move beyond social media. That is right, but I think we also should look at these societal implications of digital interaction through crisis among young people. What we've seen, I feel that, and what others have highlighted too, and you pointed out the interconnectedness of all our presentations, the trust and the highly trust in the WHO and science on a global level. And I think that is something to take further and take seriously, perhaps might result in new approaches by the WHO to AI, to all sorts of other technology platforms. And also, it's also about the moving away from the national centrality. And that has been pointed out in talks here about governance and trust and risk and so on. And I think that's what we see coming through as well. And these are major trends. And I think there are a lot of challenges, opportunities with that. And that's something we have to address in the future, I feel.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Ilona, over to you for some final words.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up from there. In our Lancet report, we very much highlight the digital determinants of health, because the digital transformation and mental health was already mentioned as, you know, this silent pandemic that is catching up with us. So we feel very strongly we need to have this new view on what actually determines our health and how much these transformations are doing it, and particularly children and young people. We do talk about demography, but we haven't really realized that by 2030, 40% of the world's population is going to be under 25. And for our Lancet report, we actually did a survey with young people all around the world, and we worked with the 10 countries that had the highest youth populations. And I think we often don't connect these two big trends of, you know, more and more young people and digital transformation. And the third point, and the health effects that are then come with it. And the last point I'd really like to make, which we put very, very high on our own agenda in the Lancet Commission, is because this future belongs to these young people, that they should be involved here and now in shaping the governance of that future. And if you go to our report, you will see a whole range of statements that they have put forward. And I would urge us in any such discussions, even though you all are relatively young, even to go one step further and include young people in these debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilona. I agree, it's an important point, and we have included a youth representative during our discussion, our workshop, technical workshop, to define some scenarios. Matt, over to you for some final remarks.
Yeah, just really quickly, when we talk about governance, because I gave some remarks about governance, I think it's important to remember that governance is not necessarily something that is only done by government. There is a lot that can be done by non-governmental forces. We're talking about the power of young people, the power of social media, the power of communications, the power of stockholders meetings, the power of wider society to shape change. Not all forms of governance have to happen through parliaments and through law. And there's a lot that can be done to affect positive change through these sort of soft approaches that don't require the power of a government per se. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Matt. Miguel, any final words, positive thoughts for our audience?
No, I mean, just a little bit what I try to express. We have a huge opportunity to leverage like new technologies, AI and the digital health arena for public health intelligence, and is there. On the other hand, we also need to work on the digital red lines, human rights online, accountability criteria for mis and disinformation, and really set up the right frameworks for AI and data privacy.
Thank you, Miguel. And Elena, any final words?
Thank you. Basically, two points that I think is important to consider how climate change is going to determine future trends that and plans for doing that already. And then again, just this point about the need to lead by example and promote low carbon lifestyle choices and also working environments. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and we are a bit over time, so I think it's time to thank everybody for joining, the panelists, but also the audience. I thought this was a really rich session, and I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I did. So our next webinar is next Tuesday, and we will introduce the 4 plausible scenarios we have developed for the future of the COVID-19 pandemic and other infectious threats. So this sounds like another very good session. So I hope you will attend. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.